In our lead story today, we turn to Romania, where even during one of the weirdest weeks of world news that we've had in years, the headlines out of Bucharest still found a way to impress. To hear the Romanian government tell it, it was a dodged bullet in a moment of mortal peril, as the country just barely managed to defend against a disinformation campaign that was staggering even by modern standards. To hear the nation of Russia tell it, staring Romania down from across the Black Sea, it was a travesty of electoral injustice in which Romania insisted on ignoring the will that its people had so loudly expressed. Wind the clock back to late November, and we'll find where our story begins. On November the 24th, Romanians took to the streets to elect a new president, replacing the two-term incumbent Klaus Iohannis, who's mandated to step down due to term limits. It was expected to be a relatively change-oriented election, at least at the presidential level. For context, polling in 2023 had indicated that just a mere 8% of Romanians have a positive opinion of their president, owing to democratic backsliding, authoritarian tendencies, that sort of thing. Iohannis' party, however, was expected to do well, with current Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu looking to assume the mantle. A small handful of others were expected to give him a hard time. Liberal leader Elena Lasconi, right-winger George Simeon, and maybe a retired general named Nicolae Seca. Whichever two polled best would head off into a runoff, assuming none could capture a majority of the vote outright. But one person who was absolutely not expected to do well was Călin Georgescu, a far-right political leader and a conspiracy theorist who'd run as an independent on a pro-Russia, anti-NATO, ultra-nationalist message. Georgescu had been polling at about, if we're being generous here, 5% prior to election night, and he was expected to sort of clump around the bottom of the pack along with all the other fringe candidates. Fast forward to election night, and it was Georgescu who secured first place in the first round vote with nearly 23% in total. In second place, also headed to the runoff, was Elena Lasconi, the liberal progressive leader, with a bit over 19%. The country's incumbent prime minister placed close third, while that other right-wing leader that we mentioned before, the much better known and more established George Simeon, didn't even capture 14%. To say that this was an unforeseen outcome for Romania would be an absolutely massive understatement. Hardly any surveys had predicted that Georgescu would capture over 10% of the vote, let alone win, and although his social media postings had become popular in the country, he was still a relatively little-known figure. Prior to politics, he was a soil scientist and a UN representative for environmental programs, hardly a role that would have ever placed him in the public eye. He also claims that water is made up of something other than an oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms, but that's less a matter of political relevance and more just a thing that we could not mention. Now, in order to understand just what the situation is here, we've got to understand the fact that Georgescu's victory was not a matter of vote results that looked nothing like the actual political landscape. There were signs that something was changing late in the game, including an opinion poll published a few days prior to the election that showed that other right-wing leader, George Simeon, pulling nearly 20% of the vote for what would have been a second-place showing. But the changes in late-race momentum didn't seem to be for Georgescu, who didn't even show up in the poll's top 5. Instead, late polling showed a fractured right-wing electorate, particularly the centre-right, perhaps something that a new, unorthodox candidate could have capitalised on, but not something that Georgescu seemed actually able to leverage. And complicating all of this was the sort of political figure that Georgescu actually was, in a nation that's broadly quite pro-EU and highly mistrustful of Russia. Georgescu has in the past given lavish praise to Russian President Vladimir Putin, described Ukraine as, quote, an invented state, and referred to Romanian fascists and ultranationalists from the years before and during World War II as national heroes. Georgescu denies allegations of ideological extremism, describing himself instead as, quote, a Romanian who loves his country. But how Georgescu might have argued his ideological harmlessness was only half of the strangeness at play here. If Georgescu had been, say, a well-known figure with a public following who happened to turn a convincing about-face just before a vote, that might be one thing. Imagine 2024's Kanye West breaking back into the public consciousness with an unlikely but not impossible campaign to successfully sanitize his image and get a quarter of people to vote for him. But what Georgescu would have had to do in order to gain victory on such short notice was a hell of a lot more challenging. To carry on this same comparison, he would have had to go from little-known local hip-hop artist to well-known public figure with widely unsavory views, then rehabilitate his image or gain support among people who'd never heard of him without any media or political leaders noticing, or within just a few weeks of a major election. Take all those challenges together, and perhaps it's a bit easier to see why, when Georgescu surged to his first-round victory, Romania became very skeptical very quickly. Fast forward to Friday, December the 6th, just a mere 2 days before the runoff election that might have anointed Georgescu to Romania's presidency, and the nation's constitutional court issued a bombshell ruling. On that day, the Constitutional Court announced that the entire presidential election process would have to be scrapped and restarted. Incumbent President Iohannis would have to serve extra time. All these candidates who thought they'd lost would have to scrape together whatever money they could for a second round, and the Romanian government would have to find a way to convince its people that what they were doing wasn't a naked coup to overturn a free and fair election, but a critical step in protecting Romanian sovereignty and electoral integrity. The reason that Romania's Constitutional Court gave severe damage to the electoral system due to operations by Russia that were intended to sway the result. When it comes to the allegations against Russia, Romania has been nothing if not specific. According to Romanian investigators, the last 2 weeks before that November 24th first-round vote had seen a frenzy of purportedly Russian activity, all in Georgescu's favor. 25,000 identified pro-Georgescu TikTok accounts seemed to all come online nearly simultaneously, heaving into action with the intent to immediately court and sway public opinion. Incumbent President Iohannis classified secret documents showing that Georgescu had unlawfully received major electoral promotion support during times, under Romania's electoral law, where campaigning is illegal. Contradicting Georgescu's claim that he had spent nothing on his campaign, the declassified files alleged that it actually benefited from an influx of cash from abroad. That money was used for paid promotion for Georgescu on TikTok, where he also purportedly benefited from account coordination and recommendation algorithms. Romanian intelligence indicated that data used to access official Romanian election websites were published on Russian cybercrime forums and claimed to have identified over 85,000 individual attempts to conduct hacking or other cyber attacks against Romania's electoral system, including on election day. According to the Iohannis government, intervening and dealing with the status of this election was a matter of national security. According to Georgescu, however, it was anything but. On the day when the runoff vote would have been held, Georgescu turned up to the location where he would have cast his vote and vowed to fight the decision in the courts. His statements in part were, quote, "I ask very clearly for peace, for all the things that we have to recuperate our democracy, because democracy was cancelled with the court." The quote ends. His supporters took to the streets and social media to voice their discontent along with him. Georgescu is not the only prominent Romanian figure raising fears about the future of democracy. His opponent in the runoff, the progressive Elena Lasconi, posted a letter online to US President-elect Donald Trump with a similar broad message, albeit for very different reasons. Wrote Lasconi, "The past 35 years, we have had democracy, but government and corrupt politicians have failed to deliver for the Romanian people. I fear we have 15 years to go, maybe less. Where no one wants to go is dictatorship." The quote ends. Meanwhile, Russia denies any and all allegations of electoral interference in Romania, although much of the nation is broadly inclined to dismiss Russian claims out of hand. Moving forward, Romania's pro-Europe parties have agreed to consolidate into a clear majority government, integrating traditional political rivals in an attempt to shut out the far right. At the time of writing, it appears that the effort to do so will be successful, as the parties combine enough of a vote share, based on the first round of results in the now-annulled election, that they should win a majority. The parties are likely to rally around a single pro-Europe candidate, although they've not yet been publicly identified. Georgescu may or may not be able to run in the new round of elections, and there are no guarantees that he could be held off if he does run, although at the moment the odds are stacked heavily in the political establishment's favor. But it'll also be on the new government to address what many in Romania describe as a deeper and darker truth of the nation. One prominent Romanian ex-leader, the former deputy head of NATO, Mircea Giana, explained to the BBC this: "The Russians are hugely sophisticated, but it's hugely mistaken to believe all of this was just because of Russia. There is a whole cocktail of grievances in our society." The quote ends. Among those problems are growing poverty and wealth disparity, rising inflation, and more, all of which suggest that even if Georgescu wasn't a well-known figure before the election, there is still a reason Russia would have had luck getting people to buy in on a mass protest vote. His appeals to national pride, to returning working-age Romanians to their nation, and more are all taken as elements of a much-needed societal shift for Romania's future. As a result, it'll be hard for Romania's unpopular political leaders to stick the landing on this one. Even in a country with considerably more trust in its institutions, it would be a difficult ask to expect an entire population to simply sit by and accept as a set of electoral results were flipped on their head. Take that problem to a nation where distrust in institutions and leaders is already high, and where that maligned election produced not one, but two change candidates for a runoff, and it's not a pretty picture. As nation after nation has had to relearn in recent years, claims around the legitimacy of an election are an incredibly delicate matter where public opinion often has more power to shape reality than reality has power to shape public opinion. Even assuming that the best-laid plans of Romania's political establishment do come to pass and this grand majority coalition claims power in the electoral do-over, it'll be up to Romania, its leaders, and its people to determine how the repercussions of 2024 play out across time. And finally, there's the question of why. Why Russia would want to take such a broad, unilateral action to influence electoral outcomes in a NATO nation. After all, Russia had enough going on, from the collapse of its proxy leader Bashar al-Assad in Syria, to similar electoral backlash in Georgia, to the ongoing invasion of Romania's neighbor Ukraine. But although it's easy to see how Russia could benefit from seeing an overtly pro-Russia figure elected this year, it's important to zoom out and look at the whole picture. Unfortunately, Russia has long shown that electoral manipulation, even in NATO nations, is a win-win situation. In an ideal world, sure, they help a preferred candidate into office, but that's not what Russian disinformation is best at. It's best at sowing division, inflaming pre-existing cultural tensions, building distrust in political leaders and political objectives, and ensuring that these other nations are too busy fighting amongst themselves to stand in the way of Russia's true goals. In that regard, if Russia did indeed meddle with Romania's elections, then it appears to have already achieved victory. Electing Călin Georgescu would have simply been a few bonus points. Next up, we travel to Lebanon, where despite an absolute shellacking by Israeli forces during the back half of this year, the Iran-allied political and paramilitary movement Hezbollah still aspires to keep up the fight. As a shaky ceasefire with Israel trembles, but seems to hold for now, leaked US intelligence shows that Hezbollah is already making moves to rearm, reconsolidate, and be a thorn in Israel's side for the far future. But that's just one half of the story that we're going to tell today, as Hezbollah's best-laid plans will now have to reckon with the loss of an absolutely critical supporting element, a Syria controlled by Bashar al-Assad. The reports via US intelligence came via a Reuters report in early December, drawing on what the organization described as, quote, 4 sources briefed on updated US intelligence. Those sources included 1 senior US official, 1 Israeli official, and 2 American lawmakers. According to those sources, American intelligence has assessed during the weeks prior that, yes, Israel's long-running air and ground campaign against Hezbollah had led to significant degradation of the group's military capabilities. Nonetheless, though, that same intelligence had assessed that Hezbollah would likely work to rebuild its stockpiles and resume its long-time status as a threat to Israel, rather than pivoting its focus to disbanding or otherwise taking any of the actions that both Israel and the US had hoped that the group might decide on after having been so thoroughly targeted. Among the findings listed by Reuters were that Hezbollah is already on the ground recruiting new fighters in Lebanon and possibly elsewhere. Although the Reuters report doesn't indicate this, it's important to note what may be a fertile recruiting environment for Hezbollah right now, as the group can point to Israel's ruinous air campaign against much of Lebanon as a likely radicalizing factor for both longtime Hezbollah enthusiasts and people who hadn't previously thought about giving violent extremism a go. The report also indicates that Hezbollah is working on building new means of domestic arms production within Lebanon and re-establishing or replacing smuggling lines that run into Lebanon from neighboring Syria. Importantly, these Reuters interviews referenced intelligence collected before the start of the ongoing Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire, which includes provisions against Hezbollah procuring weapons or weapon components. But it's of course not clear that Hezbollah has any intention of following such provisions, or whether it might endure a brief period of non-proliferation before settling into a longer period of quiet rearmament later. Any capabilities Hezbollah does add, according to the report, will join existing stockpiles that are certainly diminished but are not depleted. Although the group has lost over half its stockpiles of weapons along with thousands of fighters, it's still got thousands of short-range rockets within its arsenal. Hezbollah appears to already know the transnational smuggling lines it wants to use and the international weapons production capacity that it wants to draw on. Finally, although it's suffered the decapitation of its pre-war network of leaders, the report emphasizes that Hezbollah has always been built for resilience. Quoting one of the report's sources here, the organization is designed to be disrupted. So, on its face, that state of affairs a couple of weeks ago was concerning for the United States and for Israel. But the Middle East has also been through a hell of a change since that time, namely the fall of longtime Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. Now, we've already covered the fall of Assad on this channel, but to recap it here briefly, the entire affair came by way of a lightning assault. After years of what was essentially a stalemate at the back end, almost a decade and a half of civil war, it took less than 2 weeks for a shock rebel offensive to completely collapse regime lines, conquer the capital city of Damascus, and send Assad running to Moscow with his tail tucked between his legs. For Hezbollah, that's big, bad news for several reasons, not least the fact that Hezbollah was a close non-state ally of the Assad regime and that Syria under Assad was the most closely aligned nation to Hezbollah's primary foreign backer, Iran. But it's also a problem for Hezbollah because non-Assad control over the country means that Hezbollah smuggling operations just got a whole lot more challenging. For many years, Hezbollah has taken advantage of the chaos in Syria, plus a regime that was happy to look the other way, in order to funnel everything from weapons to supplies to people to cash straight through to Hezbollah's power base in Lebanon. Some of that supply came from Iraq, shipped through Syria into Lebanon, while some of it was shipped through Iraq by way of Iran. That land bridge, Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, has long been one of Hezbollah's greatest assets to procure weapons, and it's been a nice little tool in the group's back pocket if ever they needed to accept mass support from pro-Iran militias or other groups across the Middle East. Once on the Lebanese border, Hezbollah could get its kit into the country via borderlands that Hezbollah knew well, and the Lebanese state was too weak, corrupt, and distracted to enforce. Not only that, but Hezbollah's fighters could pick up years' worth of experience fighting in Syria and could retreat to Syrian territory as a safe haven if need be. It's not clear exactly what governance in a post-Assad Syria will look like quite yet, and Iran is in the process of making its overtures to the new rebel command in hopes that they'll be willing to maintain a favorable situation for Iran and its proxy forces. But with a strong Turkish influence over the rebel movement, with the increasing likelihood of involvement from Europe, the US, and the UN, and with the dismal chances that the rebels would so quickly cozy up to the same foreign regime as the government they overthrew, Iran's chances are not looking very good. Not only that, but Israel has taken a proactive approach to dealing with the fall of Assad, not just parking troops on Syrian soil past the disputed Golan Heights, but conducting mass airstrike campaigns against the weaponry and infrastructure of the Assad regime. Once destroyed, those weapons will be unavailable not just for Syria's rebels, but for Hezbollah operatives who might otherwise have tried to smuggle them into Lebanon. And to be clear, it's a good thing that those weapons are gone. The Assad regime is known to have had an ongoing chemical weapons program, and those resources are now thought to be mostly destroyed after Israel's campaign. And look, for our part at WarFronts, we'll always take the destruction of WMDs as a win. But for Hezbollah, even before the possibility that Assad regime weaponry might be off the table, the harder possibility to stomach is that Syria may now be cut off completely. Depending on how Syria's victorious rebels choose to play the hand dealt to them, it's entirely feasible that they may seek to become part of the West's orbit in some way, either accepting direct support from the US or EU, or working with broadly pro-Western anti-Iranian partners like Saudi Arabia, or of course Turkey. In doing so, they'd gain major incentives to root out and pinch off Hezbollah supply lines on Syrian territory for entirely self-interested reasons, choke off Hezbollah as a sign of good faith to the West and the non-Iran aligned Arab world, and Syria's new administration will likely find rewards of all sorts headed in its direction. Without that land bridge to Iraq and Iran, it would become far harder for Hezbollah to procure weapons from abroad, relying on whatever small-scale smuggling might still be possible across Syria and potential shipments via Lebanon's Mediterranean ports. Lose access to the bulk of its transnational smuggling routes, and Hezbollah will have to reconsolidate at a far slower rate, or perhaps even reconsider whether reconsolidation is its best path forward. There is another side to this coin, however, in that even if Iran may have a harder time getting support to Hezbollah directly, it does have significantly heightened incentives to figure out a way forward. Iran is in a difficult spot right now. With Hamas in Gaza increasingly cut off, the Houthis in Yemen now mostly out of global news, its militia in Syria forced to look for a new way forward, and of course, its most important vassal nation having just collapsed. For Iran, that means that reconsolidating its surviving alliances, wherever possible, has never been as important as it is right now. And with fewer groups in need of support and no Assad regime to prop up, there is a fair argument to be made that Iran can now spend more of its geopolitical slush fund on Hezbollah. How Iran does that will be entirely dependent on the routes it can construct to get weapons, funding, and people to Hezbollah without interception, either in Syria, in Lebanon, or by the scrutiny of Israel. But in all likelihood, support for Hezbollah has been a bigger Iranian priority than ever, at a critical moment where Hezbollah too is at risk of coming off this grand Middle Eastern chessboard. And now let's turn our attention to Ethiopia's growing drone war. At the time, it was perhaps only the second major conflict in history after the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war to be decided by the use of drones. In the summer of 2021, as a Tigrayan column advanced on the Ethiopian capital, the government responded by unleashing newly bought UAVs from Turkey and the UAE. In the carnage that followed, the Tigrayan army was devastated. From being on the verge of marching on Addis Ababa and overthrowing Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, the rebels were driven all the way back to their stronghold in the Tigray region. When the war concluded a year later, it was with a victorious government. For most military analysts in those pre-Ukraine days, the fate of the Tigrayan forces was simply another sign that drones were going to change the face of warfare. But for the Ethiopian government, the lesson apparently went a lot deeper. They seem to have become convinced that UAVs were a magic bullet for any conflict. Not long after the Tigray war ended, the Ethiopian Air Force established a dedicated drone unit, mostly using Turkish TB2s and Chinese models. Since then, the Violence Tracking Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLED, claims that, quote, airstrikes from drones have been a key part of the government's strategy to combat anti-government militias, end quote. Yet, while drones are widely credited with turning the tide in the Tigray war, that was a very specific conflict, one in which the rebels were so well armed and trained that they functioned more like a state army than an insurgent group, an army moving in columns that could be targeted from the air. By contrast, the current civil conflicts gripping Ethiopia are guerrilla insurgencies, ones in which rebels blend in and overlap with the civilian population. And that means that the use of UAVs has led to inevitable tragedies. Tragedies that the federal government in Addis Ababa seems utterly blind to. The killing of vast numbers of civilians. Back on November the 5th, drones bombed the town of Zibis in the restive Amhara region. According to the government, they were targeting members of the Fano militias that operate in the countryside. But ACLED writes that they, quote, hit a marketplace, an elementary school, and a health center, killing 43, and that, quote, 13 children and several pregnant women, including health workers, were among those killed. And nor was this a one-off. Humanitarian reported in March that a drone strike on a town in the South Wallo zone of Amhara region destroyed a truck carrying dozens of civilians. DW writes that drones have killed farm laborers and have targeted essential facilities, including schools, hospitals, and private homes. According to ACLED data, this is part of a growing pattern. As of December the 3rd, they had recorded 52 drone strikes in Amhara region since the rebellion erupted last year, with a combined death toll of nearly 450. The Amhara Association in North America claims this is an undercount and that the real death toll closer to 750. Either way, the numbers have raised a couple of grim possibilities. One, that Ethiopia's federal government is fighting the rebellion in such a cavalier way that it's oblivious to the growing civilian casualties. Or two, that ordinary Amhara are being targeted as part of a deliberate strategy of collective punishment, not unlike how the Burmese junta bombs villages in rebel-held areas. This is something the independent state body, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, hinted at when it declared of the conflict in the Amhara region, quote, large numbers of civilians have been brutally killed by heavy artillery shelling and aerial bombardments, mostly by drones, Given that the rebels have no access to UAVs, the only ones doing this killing could be federal forces. It would also chime with their behavior in another insurgency-struck region, Oromia. Quote, drones have become an integral part of the military's efforts against the Oromo Liberation Army, which tends to operate in remote areas that are difficult for soldiers to access. In one of the bloodiest strikes, at least nearly 70 people were killed in a village in Oromia's West Shua district in October 2022. Of course, we need to point out that this is something the government strenuously denies. Army Chief Field Marshal Burhanu Jula recently told media that, quote, when we find a group of extremists, we strike with drones, but civilians will not be targeted. But there's a reason that government promises of good military conduct tend to ring a bit hollow in Ethiopia. A reason that also ties into the conflict that we started this chapter with, the conflict that helped spark the current insurgency in Amhara region, the moral abyss known as the Tigray War. And look, if you follow this channel regularly, you know that we've commented several times on the bizarre lack of mainstream media coverage surrounding this apocalyptic conflict. Over the course of 2 years, from 2020 to 2022, the Ethiopian government deliberately blockaded and starved the Tigray region, leading to the deaths of perhaps 600,000 people, more than died during the 13 years of Syria's brutal civil war. For those who want to learn more, we have some explainer videos in our archive, including one major deep dive. But for this segment, the important thing to know is that the war didn't just pit the Tigray region against the federal government, but also pulled in other actors, specifically the army of neighboring Eritrea and the Fano militias of Amhara region. For the Fano, the Tigray War was a chance to claim the disputed land of Western Tigray, known to Amhara as Walkate. This goal was accomplished via awful war crimes supported by the central government, which saw the area ethnically cleansed. However, it is important to note that it wasn't just the Fano and federal forces that were accused of crimes against humanity. One phase of the war involved a Tigrayan invasion of Amhara region in which civilians suffered eye-watering atrocities. As early as the first week of the conflict, Tigrayan forces massacred dozens of Amhara in the village of Mai Kadra, an action that triggered a revenge massacre of Tigrayans just a few hours later. We mention these horrors not to be ghoulish, but because they set the stage for the current insurgency in the Amhara region. When the Tigray conflict ended in late 2022, one key provision of the peace was the implication that Western Tigray be removed from Amhara control. This caused uproar among the Fano, who had fought and died for a government promise that Walkate would be theirs. For the Fano, it was the start of a deep betrayal, one that only got deeper in 2023 when Addis Ababa announced it was disarming all regional militias. From the Amhara perspective, disarming would leave them open for a second invasion by Tigrayan forces, which ended the war with some 200,000 soldiers still under arms. Rather than follow orders, the Fano instead rose up against the government. Those who follow news from the Horn of Africa closely probably remember what came next. In August 2023, a coordinated assault saw Fano militias briefly seize major cities and airports in Amhara region. Although Addis Ababa retook most urban areas within days, the Fano simply retreated into the mountainous countryside where they have strong support. By some estimates, as much as 80% of rural areas in Amhara region are to this day either contested or still under Fano control. Faced with such a widespread insurgency in difficult terrain, federal forces quickly turned to the thing that had so recently won the Tigray War, drone strikes. And so we come back to the main theme of this segment, the growing number of drone attacks on civilians in Amhara region and what it all means. Now, from one perspective, it could be argued that the recent uptick in drone strikes is just a side effect of violence in general increasing across the region. ACLED, after all, has noted that, quote, clashes between Ethiopia's army and Fano militias surged in October, and they appear to have stayed at high levels ever since. From another perspective, though, it could be argued that the campaign amounts to deliberate targeting of non-combatants. Deputy Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, Letitia Bada, has written about how, quote, the Ethiopian armed forces' brutal killings of civilians in Amhara undercut government claims that it is trying to bring law and order to the region. The quote ends. Regardless of the truth, the clear fact is that drones deployed by federal forces are killing a whole lot of innocent people in Amhara region right now, and that this air campaign is also expanding into Oromia with similar results. And the number of strikes, it's only increasing. A chart made using ACLED data shows that what they refer to as incidents of explosives and remote violence in Ethiopia are now almost at the level they were during the height of the Tigray War. The worst part? Such attacks may not slow down anytime soon. At a recent event, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed indicated his will to fight on, declaring, "As I have repeatedly stated, our brothers in the Amhara and Oromia regions will not defeat us, even if they fight for 1,000 years." The Fano too seem in no hurry to lay down their arms and negotiate peace. One prominent militia leader told The Economist in October that, quote, "We believe we are months away from removing the national government from power." Meanwhile, there is little sign that the drones are turning the tide of the conflict. Speaking to DW, senior researcher at the Ethiopian Peace Observatory, Braden Fuller said, quote, "I don't see any evidence that the drone strikes are having any effect at all on the ongoing clashes involving the Fano militias in Amhara region and the Oromo Liberation Army, or OLA, in Oromia regions." Yet he cautions that he expected the government to keep using UAVs regardless, even as the civilian death toll mounts and the killings breed yet more resentment of Addis Ababa. And it's here that we get to the crux of the problem. With the decentralized structure and broad support in the countryside, the Fano likely cannot be defeated by long-range strikes and intermittent clashes. Yet federal forces seem committed to this strategy, suggesting we may see more and more civilian massacres in the months to come. Back in July, the UN marked the one-year anniversary of the Amhara conflict by somberly noting that 2,000 civilians had already been killed. Unless something drastic changes soon, it's likely that come the second anniversary, that number will be significantly higher.